The United States national debt just crossed $39 trillion. Right now, the United States pays approximately $1.2 trillion per year just in interest on that debt. Not paying down the principal, not reducing what we owe, just interest. $1.2 trillion. That's more than the entire defense budget. More than we spend on Medicare, more than all discretionary spending combined. And that number is about to explode because over the next 3 years, $9 trillion in existing U.S. debt matures and needs to be refinanced. That debt was originally issued when interest rates were 0% to 2%. It's now being refinanced at 4% to 5%. When that refinancing is complete, annual interest payments will rise from $1.2 trillion to over $2 trillion. $2 trillion per year just to service debt. That's 35% of all federal tax revenue going purely to interest payments. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how America accumulated $39 trillion in debt, why it's mathematically impossible to repay, why it's accelerating exponentially right now, how it destroys economic growth, and most importantly, what happens to you, to your savings, to your job, and to your future when this debt bomb finally detonates. Because make no mistake, this debt cannot be repaid through normal means. The math doesn't work. And when governments can't repay debt, they have 3 options. Default, which destroys credibility, austerity, which triggers depression, or inflation, which destroys the currency. And America has already chosen inflation. The printing presses are warming up, and your wealth is about to be inflated away. Let me start by showing you how we got here. Because understanding the history explains why the acceleration is inevitable. In 1980, U.S. national debt was $98 billion, less than $1 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio was 35% manageable, sustainable. Then came 40 years of systematic fiscal irresponsibility by both political parties. The 1980s, Reagan era, massive military spending increased to win the Cold War. Tax cuts that reduced revenue. Debt grew from $98 billion to $2.8 trillion. The 1990s, relative stability, budget briefly balanced under Clinton. Debt grew more slowly to $5.7 trillion by 2000. The 2000s. This is where it accelerates. Push tax cuts. War on terror. Afghanistan and Iraq cost $2+ trillion. Medicare Part D prescription drug program added trillions in unfunded liabilities. Financial crisis bailouts, $700 billion TARP, plus trillions in Fed programs. By 2008, debt hit $10 trillion. The 2010s post-financial crisis, Obama's stimulus programs, continued war spending, more tax cuts, debt climbed from $10 trillion to $23 trillion by 2020. The 2020s total breakdown, COVID emergency spending, $5 trillion in stimulus, unemployment benefits, PPP loans, direct payments, infrastructure bills, student loan forgiveness attempts, more defense spending. Debt exploded from $23 trillion in 2020 to $39 trillion in early 2026. But here's what's critical to understand. It's not just the spending. It's the interest rate environment. From 2008 to 2021, interest rates were essentially zero. The Federal Reserve held rates at 0% to 0.25% for over a decade. This allowed the U.S. government to borrow trillions at almost no cost. The average interest rate on U.S. debt was around 2%. But in 2022, inflation spiked. The Fed was forced to raise rates aggressively. They went from 0% to 5.5% in just 18 months. The fastest rate hiking cycle in history. And now all that debt accumulated at 0% to 2% is maturing and needs to be refinanced at 4% to 5%. This is causing interest expenses to explode. Let me show you the math so you understand why this is a death spiral. Currently, $9 trillion of U.S. debt needs to be refinanced in the next 3 years. Old average rate 2%, new average rate 4.5%. Old annual interest cost on that $9,180 billion new annual interest cost, $405 billion. That's an additional $225 billion per year in interest expense just from refinancing existing debt. But wait, it gets worse. The U.S. is also borrowing $2 trillion in new debt every year to cover the deficit. So, we're not just refinancing old debt at higher rates. We're adding new debt at high rates. Total interest expense trajectory 2024 $1.20, $2 trillion 2027 $1.80, $8 trillion estimated 2030 $2.5 trillion projected. If rates stay elevated by 2030, the U.S. could be spending $2.5 trillion per year just on interest. That's 42% of projected federal tax revenue going purely to interest. Not defense, not social security, not infrastructure, just interest payments to bondholders. Now let me address the question everyone asks, can America repay this debt? The short answer is no through conventional means. Let me show you why with simple math. To actually pay down debt, you need to run a budget surplus. Revenue must exceed spending. You take the extra money and use it to pay off principal. The U.S. hasn't run a meaningful budget surplus since 2001. That's 25 years of continuous deficits. Current annual federal revenue approximately $4.9 trillion. Current annual federal spending approximately $7.2 trillion. Annual deficit $2.3 trillion. We're not even close to balanced, let alone running a surplus to pay down debt. Now, could we theoretically balance the budget and pay down debt? Now, let's look at the numbers. To eliminate the $2.3 trillion annual deficit, you would need to either cut spending by $2.3 trillion. That's 32% of all federal spending. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid interest for $0.6 trillion. That's legally required. You can't cut it without changing laws. Discretionary spending, defense, education, everything else, $1.7 trillion. You would have to cut discretionary spending to zero and then cut an additional $600 billion for mandatory programs. That means eliminating the entire military, all federal agencies, and cutting Social Security or Medicare by 20%. Politically impossible. Or option 2, raise taxes by $2.3 trillion. That's a 47% increase in federal revenue. Individual income taxes currently bring in $2.4 trillion. You'd need to essentially double income taxes across the board. Corporate taxes bring in $500 billion. You'd need to increase them by 5x. Wealth taxes, VAT taxes, every possible tax increase combined still couldn't close a $2.3 trillion gap without causing massive economic damage. Also politically impossible. So, the math is clear. The U.S. cannot balance its budget, let alone run surpluses large enough to pay down $39 trillion in debt. But maybe we could grow our way out. If GDP grows faster than debt, the debt to GDP ratio improves, right? Let's check that math. Current U.S. GDP approximately $29 trillion. Current debt to GDP 134%. For debt to GDP to improve, GDP growth must exceed debt growth. U.S. GDP grows at roughly 2% to 3% per year in real terms. U.S. debt is growing at 7% to 10% per year. Debt is growing 3x to 5x faster than the economy. You cannot grow your way out when the denominator GDP grows at 2%, but the numerator debt grows at 8%. The math doesn't work. The debt to GDP ratio is worsening every single year. So if we can't cut spending, can't raise taxes enough, and can't grow fast enough, what are the options? There are only 3 ways this ends. Option 1, default. The U.S. government could simply refuse to pay bondholders. Declare bankruptcy, restructure the debt. This is what Argentina did repeatedly, what Greece was forced into, what Russia did in 1998. But for the U.S., default is nuclear. The dollar is the global reserve currency. U.S. treasuries are considered the safest asset on Earth. They're the foundation of the global financial system. If the U.S. defaults, even partially, the dollar loses reserve currency status immediately. Global trade collapses because most international transactions are dollar-denominated. U.S. borrowing costs spike to 15%, 20%, or higher. The government can't function. Federal employees aren't paid. Social security checks stop. The military can't operate. Financial markets crash globally. Your 401k, your pension, everything collapses. This is economic Armageddon. So, default is theoretically possible, but practically unthinkable. The damage would be catastrophic. Option 2, austerity. The government could implement massive spending cuts and tax increases. Cut Social Security benefits by 30%, cut Medicare by 40%. Eliminate most federal agencies, raise income taxes by 50%/defense spending by 60%. This is what the IMF forced on Greece, what Europe imposed after the 2008 crisis. But austerity causes economic depression. When you cut government spending and raise taxes simultaneously, you suck demand out of the economy. Unemployment spikes, GDP contracts, tax revenues fall further. You get a death spiral where austerity makes the debt problem worse, not better. And politically, it's impossible. No elected official who votes for 30% Social Security cuts is getting reelected. The American people would revolt before accepting Greek-style austerity. So if default destroys the system and austerity is politically impossible, there's only one option left. Option 3, inflation. Print money. The Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars out of thin air and uses them to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This is called debt monetization or quantitative easing when they want it to sound technical. Here's how it works. The Treasury needs to borrow $2 trillion, but ain't find enough buyers for the bonds at reasonable rates. The Federal Reserve steps in and announces we'll buy $2 trillion in Treasury bonds. The Fed creates $2 trillion digitally, presses a button, money appears. They use that newly created money to buy Treasury bonds from the government. The government gets $2 trillion in cash to spend. The debt is paid with printed money. But what happens when you create trillions of dollars out of nothing? The money supply increases dramatically. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods. Prices rise. That's inflation. Your dollars lose purchasing power. And this is already happening. The Fed's balance sheet, which represents how much money they've printed, went from $4 trillion in 2019 to $9 trillion at the peak in 2022. They printed $5 trillion in 3 years. And guess what happened? Inflation spiked to 9%, the highest in 40 years. Prices are now 20% higher than they were in 2020. Your paycheck buys 20% less. That's the inflation tax. And it's about to get much worse. Now, let me show you why the debt is accelerating so fast right now. Because understanding the mechanism tells you the timeline. We're in what's called a debt spiral. It works like this. Year 1, the government runs a $2 trillion deficit. They borrow $2 trillion. Debt increases to $39 trillion. Interest payments rise to $1.2 trillion per year. Year 2, the government needs to pay that $1.2 trillion in interest, but they're already running deficits on everything else. So, they borrow another $2 trillion plus the $1.2 trillion for interest. Total new borrowing, $3.2 trillion. Debt increases to $42.2 trillion. Interest payments rise to $1.4 trillion. Year 3, now they need to pay $1.4 trillion in interest, plus run the government. So they borrow $3.5 trillion. Debt increases to $45.7 trillion. Interest payments rise to $1.7 trillion. You see the pattern? The interest payments themselves require more borrowing, which increases the debt, which increases future interest payments, which requires more borrowing. This is a mathematical feedback loop. It compounds, and it accelerates exponentially. Right now, we're adding $6 billion per day. In 3 years, we'll be adding $10 billion per day. In 5 years, $15 billion per day. The curve goes vertical, and there's no way to stop it without one of the 3 options: default, austerity, or inflation. Now, let me show you how this destroys economic growth, because that's where it hits the real economy and real people. Economic growth comes from investment and productivity. Businesses invest in factories, equipment, technology. Workers become more productive. Output increases. But when the government is borrowing trillions, it crowds out private investment. Here's the mechanism. The government sells $2 trillion in bonds to finance the deficit. Who buys those bonds? Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments. Where does that money come from? Savings, the pool of available capital. When the government soaks up $2 trillion in capital to fund consumption, that's $2 trillion that doesn't go to businesses. A startup that needed $10 million to build a factory CA and get a loan because the bank bought treasury bonds instead. An entrepreneur who wanted to expand can't get capital. Real economy investment gets starved. This is called crowding out. Government borrowing literally crowds out productive private investment. And it gets worse as interest rates rise. When treasury bonds pay 5%, why would anyone lend to a risky business at 7%? You just buy the risk-free government bond. So all the capital flows to the government away from productive enterprise. The result, lower business investment, lower productivity growth, lower wage growth, lower GDP growth. The economy stagnates. We're seeing this in real time. U.S. productivity growth has been declining for 20 years. Real wage growth has been stagnant since 2000. GDP growth is stuck at 2% instead of the historical 3% to 4%. The debt is strangling growth. But the impact on regular people is even more direct and devastating. Let me show you exactly how $39 trillion in debt destroys your standard of living. Impact 1, higher taxes. Someone has to pay the interest on $39 trillion. That someone is you. Interest payments are now $1.2 trillion per year and rising to $2 trillion. That money comes from your taxes. In 2030, 42% of your federal income tax will go purely to pay interest on debt, not to fund programs that benefit you, not to build infrastructure, not to pay for defense, just interest to bondholders, many of whom are foreign governments and wealthy investors. You're working to pay interest on debt accumulated before you were born. Impact 2, reduced government services. As interest payments consume more of the budget, there's less money for everything else. Education funding gets cut. Infrastructure crumbles. Veterans' benefits are reduced. Research funding disappears. Social Security and Medicare become insolvent. You pay into these programs your entire working life. But when you retire, the money won't be there because it was spent on interest. Impact 3. Inflation destroys your savings. As I showed you, the only realistic way to deal with unpayable debt is inflation. The government will print money to pay bondholders. Your dollars lose value. Your savings build over decades by less and less. If you have $100,000 saved and inflation runs at 10% per year for 5 years, Impact 4. Lower wages and fewer jobs. When the government crowds out private investment, businesses can't expand. They can't hire. They can't raise wages. Unemployment stays elevated. Workers compete for fewer jobs. Wages stagnate or decline in real terms. You work harder for less money that buys less stuff. Impact 5. Generational theft. The current generation is spending money and passing the bill to future generations. Your children and grandchildren will be born into an economy crushed by debt payments they had no part in creating. Their taxes will be higher. Their services will be worse. Their opportunities will be fewer. This is intergenerational theft on a scale never seen in human history. Now, let me give you the timeline for when this becomes a crisis, because that's the question everyone wants answered. Based on current trajectories and historical patterns, here's what happens. 2026, 20 to 27, now to 18 months. The current phase debt grows from 39T to 42T. Interest payments rise from 1.2T to 1.5T. Markets remain relatively stable because the Fed is cutting rates slightly, and there's hope for fiscal reform. Political dysfunction continues. No meaningful spending cuts or tax increases. The problem worsens, but slowly. 2027, 2028, 18, 36 months. The acceleration phase. Debt crosses $45 trillion. Interest payments hit $1.8 trillion, consuming 32% of federal revenue. A major treasury auction is poorly received. Demand for U.S. bonds weakens. Yields spike to 6% or higher. The Fed is forced to restart quantitative easing to support the bond market. First clear signs of debt monetization. 2028, 2030, 3 to 5 years, the crisis phase. Debt approaches $50 trillion. Interest payments exceed $2 trillion annually. That's 38% plus of all tax revenue, just for interest. The Fed is printing $3+ trillion per year to buy treasury bonds. Inflation spikes back above 8% to 10%. Real wages decline sharply. Social Security and Medicare funding crises become acute. Political paralysis prevents any solution. Markets begin pricing in serious default risk or currency crisis. 2030, 2035, 5 to 10 years, the restructuring phase. One of three things happens. Dollar loses reserve currency status. Oil trades in yuan or BRICS currency. International trade shifts away from dollars. The U.S. can no longer print money to pay debts. Forced austerity or default or hyperinflation scenario. Fed prints 5T pluses annually to monetize debt. Inflation goes to 15%, 20%, potentially much higher. Currency crisis, capital flight, economic chaos, or international debt restructuring. Some form of global conference where creditors China, Japan, etc. impose terms on U.S. fiscal policy. Partial default on debt owed to foreigners. Loss of economic sovereignty. The exact form is unclear, but the math guarantees one of these outcomes within 10 years. The debt cannot continue growing at 8% to 10% annually when the economy grows at 2%. That gap must close, and when it closes, it will be violent. So what do you actually do? How do you protect yourself when your own government is destroying the currency and bankrupting the nation? First, understand that inflation is the chosen path. Default destroys credibility. Austerity is politically impossible, so they will inflate. That means your defense strategy is positioning for inflation. Own hard assets that can't be inflated away. Physical gold and silver, real estate and strong markets, commodities and commodity-producing equities, Bitcoin and scarce digital assets. If you understand the risks, international stocks and assets outside the dollar system. These assets maintain or increase value as currency devalues. Second, minimize exposure to dollar-denominated fixed income. Bonds, especially long-term bonds, get destroyed by inflation. cash loses purchasing power. If you hold 10-year treasury bonds paying 4.5% and inflation runs at 8%, you're losing 3.5% per year in real terms. You're guaranteed to lose money. Third, eliminate fixed-rate debt if inflation benefits borrowers. If you have a 30-year mortgage at 3% and inflation runs at 10%, you're paying back the loan with cheaper dollars. That's actually beneficial. But variable rate debt or high-interest debt will destroy you. Pay off credit cards and adjustable rate mortgages immediately. Fourth, invest in skills and education that can't be inflated away. In inflationary crisis, the people who survive are those with valuable skills. Medical, engineering, skilled trades, anything that produces real value. You can't inflate away a doctor's ability to heal or a plumber's ability to fix pipes. Fifth, build resilience and self-sufficiency. When currencies collapse and governments fail, supply chains break, have stored food, water, essentials, have backup plans, have community networks. The people who suffer most in crisis are those completely dependent on fragile systems. Let me bring this to a conclusion with the brutal truth. The United States has $39 trillion in debt that is mathematically impossible to repay through conventional means. The debt is growing at 8% per year while the economy grows at 2%. Interest payments are consuming an ever larger share of the budget. Within 5 years, the government will spend more on interest than on defense. Within 10 years, interest could consume 50% of all revenue. There's no political will to cut spending or raise taxes enough to fix this. Neither party is serious about fiscal responsibility. They'll keep borrowing until the system breaks. And the system will break. The only question is whether it breaks through default, which is unlikely, through austerity, which is politically impossible, or through inflation, which is the guaranteed path. They will print money. They will inflate the debt away. And in the process, they will destroy the dollar's purchasing power and your savings along with it. This isn't a prediction. This is math. The debt spiral is already underway. The Fed has already printed $5 trillion in 3 years. Inflation has already hit 9%. Your cost of living has already increased 20% since 2020. And this is just the beginning. The real crisis comes when the debt crosses $50 trillion and interest payments hit $2.5 trillion annually. And when the Fed is forced to print $3 trillion to $5 trillion per year just to keep the government funded. When inflation runs at 10%, 15%, 20%. When the dollar loses reserve currency status because nobody wants to hold a currency that is being debased at 15% annually. That timeline is 5 to 10 years away. You have a window right now to position to move out of dollar-denominated paper assets to own hard assets, productive assets, international assets to eliminate bad debt and build skills. Most people won't act. They'll trust the system. They'll believe the government will fix it. They'll hold cash and bonds and watch their wealth evaporate. The 5% who understand what's coming will position accordingly. They'll be the ones who preserve wealth through the crisis. Which group will you be in? If this analysis showed you the mathematical reality of America's debt crisis, subscribe immediately and turn on notifications. The next video breaks down exactly which assets perform best during currency debasement and how to build an inflation-resistant portfolio. You need to see it before this crisis accelerates. The US has $39 trillion in debt that can never be repaid. The printing presses are warming up and your wealth is the target. The math is clear. The timeline is 5 to 10 years. The only question is whether you see it coming in time to protect.